This day has been long coming, and I can't say I'm excited. I knew that this was going to happen. I've been predicting it's going to happen for a long time. We've been seeing a lot of restrictions on trans healthcare, in particular restrictions on trans youth healthcare. And so what typically happens is like a ban is introduced in a conservative area of the country, a conservative state, typically a red state. And then there are challenges where people take to the courts and they say, hey, no, this is restricting my rights. This is restricting the rights of my children. This is restricting my rights as a parent to make educated health decisions, medical decisions for my child. And it's been kind of going, like, it depends on where you live, really. In some places, the courts are going, yeah, well, whatever. You don't have the right to seek gender affirming care. And then there are other places where it's like, no, this is a 14th Amendment right issue. You can't give cisgender kids this medication if they start puberty kind of early. But you can't and then at the same time not give them to trans, because the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. It's one of the many things that's in the 14th Amendment. But, there have been times where we assume that the 14th Amendment is going to be upheld and then something dumb happens. Like, I worry a bit about the Supreme Court taking this issue, because you would think, okay, 14th Amendment should cover things like, the right to abortion. You can't limit certain people's right to make medical decisions for their body because of who they are, because they're women, right? But then they reversed it with Dobbs. They overturned Roe v. Wade. They found that, whatever. 14th Amendment doesn't actually protect your right to get an abortion, and it just doesn't matter because it's not deeply rooted in our nation's history. Like, one of the goofiest things I've ever heard. But here we are now, finally, sometime in the next 6 months, probably, the Supreme Court is going to hear a case regarding gender affirming care for trans children. Let's start with this article from CNN. The Supreme Court on Monday agreed to hear the Biden administration's challenge to a trans care ban in Tennessee, delving into the complicated and politically fraught issue of gender affirming care in a substantive way for the first time. There was a case in, I think, either Utah or Idaho where the Supreme Court basically said you cannot have a statewide injunction while this case is being heard in the courts. Or, the two trans youth who were challenging the law got to keep seeking healthcare, but every trans youth is blocked from receiving this healthcare in that state until this finishes going through the courts. So that's what they mean by substantive. This is going to be the first time they're really tackling the issue head on. The state law enacted last year bans hormone therapy and puberty blockers for minors and imposes civil penalties for doctors who violate the prohibitions, which means the doctors can be sued for providing this care. It's a distinction because it's not a criminal offense. It's not like the doctors will go to jail for it. Nearly half of the U.S. states have enacted bans on trans care for minors, according to the Human Rights Campaign. The case will likely be heard this fall. Speaking of fall, I just threw my chapstick on the floor. Chapstick. Steve Vladek, who is a CNN Supreme Court analyst and professor at UT School of Law, says the Supreme Court was always going to have to resolve how state bans on gender-affirming medical care can be reconciled with its approach to sex-based discrimination. Today's grant sets up this issue as one of the early blockbusters for the court's upcoming term. So this term is going to go from it's going to start in October and end in June next year. So basically as early as October, this case is going to be going before the Supreme Court. Yeah, oral arguments and a ruling are expected during the court's next term. And right now there is a 6-3 conservative majority. I'm just going to flip-flop between these two articles, apparently. There were laws in Kentucky and Tennessee which were challenged by the Biden administration, along with families of trans minors. The Supreme Court only agreed to hear the challenge filed by the Biden administration in Tennessee. In September, the 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati reversed a district court ruling that blocked the gender-affirming care ban from being enforced. In other words, the appeals court allowed the ban to take effect. This is, like I said, we've been expecting this to happen for months, that the state Supreme Court says one thing, And then the appeals court, which covers like several different states. Like there's several different appeals courts that each cover like a group of states. And then once the appeals court gives a decision, then, you know, one side or the other is going to appeal up. We've always known that that's going to be the case. Either the side that wants to restrict care is going to be shut down and then they're going to appeal to the Supreme Court, or the side that is supporting trans youth having access to this care is going to get shut down and then appeal up to the Supreme Court. Hi, I'm Alexander and this is Mitternacht. You should hit the like button and subscribe and check out the Patreon. And ooh, look at this hoodie I'm wearing. It's merch. Check it out. Links in the description. Thank you. Her name is Amy Coney Barrett, right? Before Barrett was on the court, there was a case where Kavanaugh wrote where the majority ruled that anti-trans discrimination amounted to sex-based discrimination. So while this should be an obvious duh with these bans being unconstitutional, I have some optimism that they won't just give the blanket conservative answer. Right. And I do agree, like that is something that's worth pointing out. It was, I think it was an employment case, right? Like two gay men and one trans woman, or the other way around, 3 gender identity or sexual orientation related issues. They all were kind of pushed together and brought before the court. And they determined that, like, yeah, if you were to discriminate against a man who's married to a man, but you would not discriminate against a woman who is married to a man, then you are doing a sex-based discrimination by saying, like, men are not allowed to do this thing that women are allowed to do, right? And then a similar deal for the trans person. If you were to say that a cisgender woman is allowed to wear a dress at work, but a transgender woman is not allowed to wear a dress at work, like even if you were to reduce it down to she's a man, whatever, like if you were to say, yeah, that women are allowed to wear dresses to work, but men are not allowed to wear dresses to work, and that's a legal standing, then that's obviously sex discrimination, because you're saying it's okay for certain people to do this, but not for others, based on who and what they are physically. So I think that, yeah, that's one area where we might have an in that, like, it just purely is sex discrimination, that sex is a class that includes gender identity and sexual orientation, which has been the case in many court cases up until this point. And I think that Biden's administration itself has, like, officially declared that sex discrimination includes those other categories as well. And then there's the 14th Amendment concept of equal protection under the law. Can you treat cisgender people like this and then treat transgender people like that under the law? Should not be legal, right? So I would say it's not entirely hopeless, but I'm not enthusiastic. This has been like, every time we have good news on this channel where trans people win in the courts, like there was recently in Florida, that the Supreme Court in Florida, I think, decreed that preventing adults and minors from accessing this care is unconstitutional, then, like, it's good news. But I always, at the end of those articles, at the end of those news segments, I'm like, well, it's good news for now. It's good news until this gets appealed, because then again, yeah, it's going to go through the appeals court, and then we'll talk about it again. And then it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and this is the ultimate judgment. Like, this is us hitting, like, the ultimate judgment on whether trans people have the right to medical care, and in particular trans children in this case. I don't think that this is necessarily going to have ramifications for adults. I think that this is in particular addressing the children, but let me see. So Tennessee's law says that medical providers cannot perform procedures that, quote, enable a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with the minor's sex, or, quote, treat purported discomfort or distress from a discordance between the minor's sex and asserted identity. So this does specifically refer to minors, although I'm almost certain that this will have ramifications for adults, even though this doesn't particularly touch on the adults thing. But if it's going to become a precedent, either way, they are hearing the case. It will become a precedent, and they will nationally be saying whether yes or no it is acceptable to limit this right, limit this access. I mean, this could be great news, right? I'm a cynic. I'm cynical at this point about the Supreme Court. It could be the case that the Supreme Court declares, no, you are not legally allowed, it is unconstitutional to restrict the rights of trans children to access medical care, or that it's unconstitutional in some way to restrict parents' rights to make decisions for their children medically. You know, it could well be the case that with this decision, all trans youth care bans across this country will be basically like, well, it's unconstitutional. You cannot enforce this law. There will be no lower court decision that can supersede the Supreme Court. So if Supreme Court in this case takes this case from Tennessee and goes, listen, this is not allowed, you can't do it, then in other states where this is going through the court systems, the courts are going to have to go, hey, look, the Supreme Court just said you're not allowed to do this. It's not acceptable for you to do this. So it's just going to it could de facto cancel all youth care bans, which would be incredible. I don't really feel confident that that is going to occur. And maybe they will come down on it depends on where you live. I mean, I don't really see how. I think it's going to go either way. This is my opinion. It's going to go either, yes, states have the right to restrict this access, which will mean that we are going to live in an increasingly split country. Like trans people in red states live in a different country essentially than trans people in blue states. Like you do not have rights depending on what your zip code is, right? Or they're going to, well, I mean, I guess they could say that it's unconstitutional to allow this, I suppose. So those are the three options are they are going to say, no, you are not allowed to do this point blank period. Nobody is allowed to restrict this access. Or we're going to leave it up to the states. Certain states can do whatever, just like they did with abortion. Or they could say there is no right to do this. And basically we're going to say even the states that have put this in are going to be overruled. I don't know how that last argument would pan out exactly. And I think that's the least likely outcome for them to say no state has the right to allow this effectively. Watch them blue ball us and be not this one, but no precedent. Yeah. It's just so unclear. And that's really frustrating to be in this situation where our rights are hanging in the balance and it's just it could go either way. I have no idea. It's like the presidential election. I have no idea. It could literally go either way. And I could not possibly even begin to predict which way it's going to go. Let me see if there's anything else in here. I'm reading. Okay, so the Supreme Court is not going to weigh in this time on the particular issue of whether this law violates the right of parents to make healthcare decisions for their children. I think that this is going to primarily go off of the 14th Amendment. Okay, let me see this. Oh, no. I guess it's important to note, while we're on the subject, that polls in this country are finding that a strong majority oppose gender-affirming care bans for trans minors. So this is another one of those issues that it's not popular amongst voters. Now, it also so happens that a slim majority in this poll think that transitioning is morally wrong, but it seems even people who think it's morally wrong think that the government is overreaching when they get involved with this, when they try to dictate who is allowed to get this stuff. But according to polls, even amongst Republicans, a majority think that you shouldn't be banning this care. It sort of depends on where you live, right? In this particular poll, 53% of Republicans favor bans on gender-affirming care for minors. I saw a poll recently in South Carolina where about 50-odd% of Republicans were against a ban on gender-affirming care for minors. But yeah, even Republicans are not overwhelmingly supporting this level of government overreach. The thing that makes it unclear is that this court has pretty low levels of public credibility because they are willing to pull BS out of the air to justify their rulings. Truly, at least a principled conservative court you could have a handle on, this group is wild. If the government can force you to not let your kids be trans, then the government can force you to trans your kids, but who cares about principles? Who the hell knows what is going to happen here? Okay, I don't think there's anything in the actual court document that's worth looking at. Let's see. Ooh, yawn. Okay, yeah, I will say that one thing that's worth adding from Aaron in the Morn is that the announcement that the court will hear the case came on the 2nd anniversary of the Dobbs decision. Yeah, remember how it was 2 years ago that many of us lost our actual right to get abortions? Wow. One component of that decision was the Glucksberg test, which claimed that equal protection rights must be, quote, deeply rooted in this nation's history and traditions. Notably, many things commonly found to be unconstitutional and atrocious, such as segregation and anti-miscegenation laws, are, quote, deeply rooted in American history and traditions. In this Sixth Circuit Court decision from Tennessee, the majority of the justices similarly used the Glucksberg test to deny trans youth in that state equal protection. Yeah, so this case does invoke the deeply rooted in our nation's history thing. So, yup. Who knows what's going to happen? But we'll be covering it, I'm sure. Whichever way it goes, we're going to cover it. If things go badly, if things go well, if things don't particularly pan out, like, I don't know that there's any way that this is going to go down that doesn't have like rippling ramifications for trans people across the country. Right? Imagine having to learn this rule in civics classes. The Glucksberg test, they just made it up, is a brand new thing that has nothing to do with anything. It's not a constitution thing, like the idea that something must be deeply rooted in our nation's history, that it has nothing, it's not in the Constitution, it has nothing to do with anything. The court is supposed to be ruling pretty much exclusively on what the Constitution says. That's the point of the Supreme Court, is to say, yo, does this law follow the Bill of Rights and the Constitution? Nope, turns out they can just make things up. But yep, that's all for today. We will continue covering this as more developments occur. Happy Pride! Happy Pride to my patrons, especially Tiago Nascimento, Mersh Rolvog, Jack, Amanda B., Wellington Marcus, Michelle Frateroli, Michelle Winter, Danielle McDonald, Jamie Jam, DZXN, Nova, Sojo, Athiet, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Desi Quiche, Pasnell Infinity, Celeste, Kevin Young, Elizabeth Bartell, Liam Hodgson, Ella V. Nobody, Mr. Atheist, and Suzanne Maynard.